On this episode of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 news stories as of March 31st, 2025. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So we're going to get right into it because there's a lot of ship going on. 5 big stories. I want to start off with an update on 2 stories that we have covered extensively here at What's Going On with Shipping, and then delve into some others. We're going to look at Russia. We're going to look at Chinese ports. We're going to look at the container ship issue with the hearings and the prospective port fees and tariffs. I mean, just a lot going on. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. First, I want to give an update on the situation regarding the motor vessels Solong and the motor tanker Stena Immaculate. You may remember that these 2 vessels were involved in a collision off the east coast of England. The Solong was heading southbound out of Scotland and ran into the anchored Stena Immaculate, resulting in a massive fire. These images sent to us by some of our viewers here. The burnt out nature of the vessel, the collision at the bow, rescue personnel are on board along with salvage crew. They are still trying to ascertain the location of the one missing crew member. Solong had been towed up to Aberdeen in Scotland. It looks, based on the imagery, that the ship will eventually be scrapped. The Stena Immaculate is still anchored off of the Humber. Plans are to bring a tanker out, offload the fuel from Stena Immaculate. The salvage team is on board. They have the power to the vessel, so they'll be able to use the ship's tank system and pump system to offload the vessel. And then the vessel will be sent into Newcastle for an extensive survey. Meanwhile, over in Nova Scotia, the MSC Baltic 3 is still aground in the region. They were able to get on board that vessel, bring some barges alongside, offload fuel and some hazardous cargo that was on board. The plan is to continue to lighter the vessel, try to get some of the containers off of it, lighting the ship's condition so potentially they can tow her out. You'll notice in this image she is distinctly down by the stern, right around the S in MSC. She's beginning to crack, and there is some flooding in the after holds and engineering space, but they have been able to get propulsion, or I should say power, back up to the ship, but they have not yet begun the process of taking the vessel off the rocks. I think there's a bit of a fear here that the ship may break up. Story number 2 deals with the issue of tariffs and port fees. Now, we've covered this quite a lot, and I'll have some links above here where you can take a look at where we've covered this in more detail. But just to synopsize right here, President Trump has imposed a series of tariffs. So, for example, there is a 20% tariff on goods coming in from China. There are 25% tariffs for goods coming in from Canada and Mexico. It's 10% for energy coming in from Canada. And he is talking about reciprocal tariffs on other nations. Then the U.S. Trade Representative under Section 301 conducted an investigation into Chinese maritime dominance in shipbuilding, logistics, and shipping in general. This was started actually under the Biden administration, continued through the Trump administration, and we just had 2 days of hearings last week on the subject. The plan with the port fees is to impose port fees if you are having ships that are Chinese built, if you have ships that are being built in China, or if you operate ships within your fleet that are in Chinese. And each of those could incur up to $1 million fee, and they could be cumulative so that you can arrive in a port and have up to a $3 million port fee to pay. And this has obviously garnered a lot of issues. The tariffs, along with the U.S. Trade Representative's port fees, have led to some sky is falling commentary. I give you Malt Humbert over at G Captain's story from earlier last week. Trump port levies on Chinese ships could mean billion-dollar, quote, trade apocalypse, unquote. Industry executives said. We heard this coming out of the TPM conference early in March over in Long Beach, and it is continuing right now. And if you were there on Monday or Wednesday, I was not. I have just heard from it. And by the way, U.S. Trade Representative still waiting for the transcript from those hearings because, again, we couldn't afford to have a recording done, either video and audio, because it's only 2025. Not like we have that technology. But what we've heard was a lot, I mean a lot of issues about sky is falling, that this is going to cause massive problems. Well, let's look at that. So we heard from U.S. fossil fuel and farm groups who are railing against the Trump port fee plan at the hearing. The proposed fees could cost up to $3 million per port call, but when you get into the specifics of what they're saying, it could have substantial impact. So a study by Trade Partnerships Worldwide found that the fees could send exports of all down as much as 18.6%, coal down by as much as 24.5%. It said exports of soybeans, a top U.S. agricultural export, could tumble as much as 42.2%. And bananas, dear God, bananas may be even more endangered because of the smaller vessels that haul the cargo out of the Caribbean. I talked about this on a video recently where we were discussing this. Smaller container ships would be leveled the same fee as larger container ships. That's why I think the U.S. trade representatives will actually modify their fee schedule. Story goes on, the fees would be a double whammy for Purdue ag business, hitting both the animal feed it imports and the chickens it exports. Goes on here with a quote, "We can't tax our way into a competitive ocean shipbuilding program," unquote, said Peter Freeman, the executive director of the Agricultural Transportation Coalition. I agree with that. We cannot, and that's why we need to have a sound and cohesive national maritime strategy, which we are currently lacking. We really need to come up with this. However, a part of that would be potentially fees or taxes on some imports and exports. I mean, there's no other way around it. We have allowed our shipping industry to lag for 40 years, and now we're just waking up that this has happened. Stories go on. This one from Bloomberg. Shippers and steelmakers spar over Trump levies for Chinese vessels. There was a lot of case studies that were done and examples that highlighted this. What's interesting is the comments coming in from outside the industry. So in Japan and Korea, for example, would struggle to fill the U.S. demand for non-China shipbuilding. That's from an NYK line exec. So if all of a sudden you can't use Chinese ships or you don't want to incur the loss from the Chinese vessels, then you would have to go get ships from Japan and Korea. The problem is Japan and Korea have been suffering from the expanded Chinese shipbuilding. Their production is down also. Then you have the planned U.S. auto tariffs, which could shake global industry as that hikes prices and job losses could loom because of the amount of parts that come into the United States. A lot of that comes just over the border from Canada and Mexico, although there are some international parts. This could have another impact, and we're seeing this in the car carrier industry, particularly the car carrier industry, which has made huge orders in Chinese yards for more car carriers. On the other side, there is a lot of attention right now for potential reform in areas of maritime shipping. So here, a Reuters story, Alaska governor to brief Trump on Asia gas push as tariffs bite. One of the big issues is Alaska wants to export more LNG, particularly on the North Slope. They need LNG carriers coming in. In particular, they just don't want to export LNG over to Asia. They want to export it they want to move it to the United States. However, there are no U.S. LNG carriers. Did a story the other week, linked above there, that the U.S. just reflagged in a LNG carrier under the provisions of a Coast Guard Authorization Act of 1996, allowed them to bring in a foreign-built LNG to move liquefied natural gas from Corpus Christi, Texas, over to Puerto Rico. I am adamant that we need to bring LNG tankers into the U.S. fleet immediately and initiate the process whereby they can be used in the coastal trade until LNG tankers can be built domestically in the United States. We can do it. We've done it in the past. We've got to get shipbuilding back up and running in the United States to be a bit more competitive. But right now, Korea is building liquefied natural gas carriers. No reason we shouldn't be using them. In the meantime, the ship owners are adjusting contracts for U.S. tax on China vessels. So we're seeing this as a Bloomberg story on May 28th. Ship owners and charters are altering leasing contracts to cope with the multi-million-dollar port fees. It goes on, the contours of Washington's plan to revitalize the shipbuilding industry are unclear, and the U.S. Trade Representative has yet to make concrete proposals. Some new provisions in leasing contracts will establish that all duties and taxes, if proposed by the USTR and introduced, will be for charterers to cover, the people added. Another version caps the amount that a ship owner pays, with the charterer covering the remaining fees. So more than a third of the tonnage from ships currently trading were built in China. That's according to Clarkson. And at the hearing in Washington, ahead of the final proposals, which are due in April, lawmakers, labor unions, steel manufacturers, everyone came in and had these contexts. In the meantime, you see this story over at the Journal of Commerce. Plan to tax Chinese ships turned maritime malaise into brainstorming session. So they quote Lauren Began, the maritime professor, friend of our show, talking about this. Began said that the hearings forced the industry to think about ways that would allow the Trump administration to progress in its goals toward revitalizing the shipping industry and the U.S. fleet. Quote, if the USTR just held a public hearing about how trade policies were impacting our shipbuilding industry, no one would have come. I would have come. I think Lauren and I would have gone. She goes on, this made everyone pay attention, and it also forced them to think creatively. How else would you have gotten the entire industry together to transform like this? I 100% agree with Lauren. I think she's right. The only way you do this is by putting something out like the U.S. Trade Representative's port fees. Now, all of a sudden, that is being done. I will note that I just had on my channel Ross Kennedy, the huntsman himself, in a new feature I'm calling Between Two Sterns. That's right, all new interviews being done now on what's going on with shipping will be called Between Two Sterns. I just thanked you to my viewers for that great idea of a title. It is fantastic. But Ross and I discussed this issue extensively, and I just want to take a moment and note something here real quick. So Ross is very pro-Trump, and that came out in the interview. I will interview anyone when it comes to shipping. I interviewed people who were very pro-Biden during the Biden administration. If Harris won, I'd interview people who were pro-Harris. I don't care what their political affiliation is. Understand, I'm going to talk about the shipping legislation, and right now President Trump is in office. He is pushing the shipping legislation. If you don't like it because I'm talking about it, don't watch. I mean, I can't tell you anything more than that. If, however, you want to know what the ship is happening, then stay tuned for us, and I'm going to try to give it to you as level balanced as I can. Just my little editorial here today. Sorry, I don't mean to get up on a soapbox. Anyway, Ross and I had a very interesting conversation, and one of the things we did talk about was how the shipping industry is going to respond by this. And one of the things I thought Ross did particularly well was discuss the issue about the fact that the shipping firms are going to want to move some of their ships out of U.S. trade and bring those non-Chinese built ships in. There's a couple of shipping lines that don't have that many Chinese ships. And because these shipping lines are in these vessel sharing agreements, not cartels. No. It's not a cartel. Don't call it a cartel. They don't want you to call it a cartel. Kind of a cartel. But in these vessel sharing agreements, they can move vessels around and carry cargo. So if you're Costco and Evergreen and CMA CGM in the Ocean Alliance, you can move some cargo around. Costco can get the cargo off their vessels onto CMA CGM, onto Evergreen vessels. Evergreen particularly does not have a lot of Chinese-built ships because they're Taiwanese. Ironically, the Chinese are going to use a Taiwanese shipping firm to get around the fees that we're imposing on them for their shipbuilding. It's kind of weird, but that's going to probably happen. That is going to be a way for them to get around all of this. And again, I thought Ross had many interesting ideas. Again, if you don't like someone's political affiliation, that's fine. But the issue here is not political. It is economic, talking about shipping. Then we have this story. Largest U.S. importers are finalizing contracts in unsettled Trans-Pacific. So one of the concerns ocean carriers had is that the war may be ending in the Red Sea. The Red Sea may be opening up. Trade may be stabilizing back down again. And that will mean low rates. Rates are going to start to plummet. Well, there's been a lot of issues been played here by a lot of people to try to get rates artificially higher. We saw this kind of confrontation between labor unions on the East and Gulf Coast, the ILA, versus the U.S. Maritime Alliance. The U.S. Maritime Alliance is made up largely of the ocean shipping carriers. We've seen that the ocean shipping carriers have not been wanting to go through the Red Sea, even though they had about 2 months of peace there. And while we're still having strikes right now, there was a moment there. But this story came out talking about rates. So, according to the Journal of Commerce, the rates being set right now from Asia to the U.S. West Coast for an FEU, a 40-foot equivalent unit, right now ranges from $1,600 to $1,800, and about $1,000 per FEU higher than that to the East Coast. Most trans-Pacific service contracts will run from May 1st through April 30th, 2026. Last year, the large big box retailers signed service contracts in the range of $1,400 to $1,450 per FEU to the West Coast and about $1,000 per FEU higher to the East Coast. However, within weeks of these agreements being signed, spot rates popped to levels not seen since COVID-19. That was obviously because of the Houthi and what was happening. So we're seeing rates come back in, and rates are being negotiated. So these rates, about $1,600 to $1,800 and then about $1,000 higher to go to the East Coast, are substantial. They're more than what they were getting last year, and that's exactly what the ocean carriers wanted. A little bit of higher rates. Now what they can do is start taking vessels off service, laying them up because they have too much capacity, and ensure that they have it. However, now with the tariffs and the port fees, if they have to start shuffling ships around, they'll start charging more because they're going to have to alter service. And one of the big things that the ocean carriers are wanting more than anything else is to ensure that rates never drop down to the level they were pre-COVID, because that was not a great time for them. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our third story. So you get this story over at G Captain from Bloomberg. Global shipping insurance may shift if Russian sanctions end, BIMCO says. BIMCO is a large ship advocacy group. The concern here is that Russia, if sanctions end, will start pulling back into the mainstream. In other words, the dark fleet, the shadow fleet, the parallel fleet, whatever you want to call it, the ghost fleet, may go away, and we may actually start seeing actual insurance on these vessels. One of the interesting studies we're seeing come out right now is a lot of Russian vessels are sailing with no insurance whatsoever. There is no mechanism out there to ensure that ships sailing in international waters have insurance. There is nothing. Basically what happens is when a ship comes into your waters, well, then you can do what's called port state control. You can board the vessel and ensure they're meeting all the obligations that they are supposed to. However, if a ship sails from Russia and heads to India or China, if it doesn't sail into your territorial waters, you really have no control and no means to stop them. Under Section 19 of the UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, they have the right for innocent passage. So ships can sail, and the goal here has been really to try to rein in the Russian fleet, get it back under the umbrella of international control, because right now it's operating as a separate entity. Now, Russian crude is flowing high. I mean, we're at the 5-month high while the peace talks are underway. Now, we are seeing some movement in the peace talks. We see this story about EU transshipment ban on Russian LNG taking effect. In other words, you can't load LNG from one vessel to another. They're forcing the shift of ship-to-ship transfers. One of the things that the Russians have been doing is bringing tankers, LNG tankers, oil tankers, diesel tankers, and bring them down to anchorages off of Spain, off of Greece, and other countries around the European Union, and doing ship-to-ship transfers. They want to consolidate the cargo into larger vessels to make the transoceanic voyages. They have to be in smaller vessels coming out of the Baltic, out of the Black Sea, and even some out of the Arctic. Now, sanctions are taking hold. India, for example, has increased the number of ships that it will not accept from Russia. So this story from Bloomberg, India port bars tanker hauling Russian crude. That is leading to Russian oil freight out of the Baltic heading to India. So we're seeing the impact that India enforcing the sanctions have. Remember, we have no mechanism, the West, the EU, to make India do this. However, India will come under sanctions, or more importantly, companies could be potentially sanctioned in India that purchase Russian sanctioned oil. And so you're using basically the threat of issues to make India comply, and India is. Although India has been a major consumer of Russian oil throughout the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Meantime, Russians are not sitting still. They just constructed their first domestically LNG carrier, although it is facing delays as its sea trial drags on. A liquefied natural gas carrier is a very sophisticated vessel to build. Russia builds nuclear submarines, so they can definitely build an LNG, although they don't have a great track record when it comes to shipping. The Russia had been procuring most of their liquefied natural gas carriers from Korea. But there was a fear early during the Russia-Ukraine conflict that those LNG carriers would have been stopped. They weren't. They were held for just a brief period of time. They've been able to procure them from Korea. However, Russia wants to create its own domestic shipping industry. It sounds very familiar. In the meantime, sanctions against Iran are increasing. We've seen a whole slew of new sanctions being leveled out of OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the United States State Department, but also the European Union. And what this leads is to a fleet of Iran oil-filled tankers building up off the coast of Malaysia as the sanctions mount. Now, you can expect to probably see some ship-to-ship transfers take place, try to hide that oil, and to get it exported in one way or the other. In the meantime, the U.S. is negotiating between Russia and Ukraine for a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. Now, while Russia and Ukraine have not been engaged in targeting commercial vessels directly, there have been commercial vessels hit. Russia, when they attack ports, will indirectly hit commercial vessels and have killed merchant mariners. The Ukrainians largely target naval vessels, although they have targeted Ukrainian commercial vessels that support the Navy. Here, they're trying to end this once and for all and really turn the Black Sea into a demilitarized zone so that cargo can flow very freely. It's flowing pretty good right now. Matter of fact, we saw a spike in cargo coming out of Ukraine. However, there is still the fear of escalation. And with that agreement now in place, we'll see whether or not we see more traffic coming in and out of the area. The problem, of course, is always it just takes one incident to trigger this into a much larger conflict. And then we have Venezuela. This story from Reuters: oil loading slows at Venezuela's ports amid U.S. tariffs, license termination. We have seen continually that really Venezuela is one of the births of the dark fleet along with Iran. And now Venezuela is facing these sanctions being imposed by President Trump. So this puts the oil market in a wild state of flux right now because of the potential for Russian sanctions maybe to get eased, more Russian oil coming back into Western markets. This just, again, causes massive speculation on what's going to happen in terms of the oil. We're seeing tanker stocks go all over the place. They have not been stable at all. Not that they've ever really been stable to begin with. But now with sanctions being leveled against Iran and Venezuela, remember the Red Sea strikes by the United States. I made this argument in a video about the Red Sea that one of the reasons that the Americans are really hitting the Houthi particularly hard, I don't think they expect the Houthi to give up with a military strike. They got bombed by 10 years by the Saudis. I think that is a leverage mechanism they're going to use with Iran. And one of the other mechanisms they have with Iran is to lighten up on the sanctions. We shall see what happens. The other story coming out was one regarding the sale of Hutchinson ports from China. It's a Hong Kong-based company. CK Hutchinson owns a lot of ports around the world, one of the biggest port operators in the world, including a port at each end of the Panama Canal, to BlackRock, a U.S. investment firm in conjunction with TIL, that is Mediterranean Shipping Company's logistics firm. Well, this story came out over at GCAP from Reuters. China halts Panama port sale to BlackRock. Now, I want to be clear about something. The sale of Hutchinson is not just the Panama ports. I think this is a big misconception. What BlackRock was buying was the entire CK Hutchinson portfolio of ports. And that is a massive entity. We're talking about ports throughout Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Australia, and in and around the Americas. And if you are China, China does not want to see CK Hutchinson divest itself of these holdings. Even though it's a Hong Kong company, it still has a lot of oversight by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, the major political party in China. And so that issue is now up for debate. We knew there was going to have to be clearance for Hutchinson to make this move, and now we saw China come out loudly against this. We even saw China state media blast Hutchinson's port deal. So a social media account linked to state broadcast CCTV said China had significant national interest in the transaction and that the sale was, quote, tantamount to handing a knife to an opponent. And as a Hong Kong company, CK Hutchinson should be careful about how it handled deals that could harm China's national interests, said the post from the account. I'm not even going to try it. I will get killed no matter how I say that word. We also had a report on Friday from Reuters that said CK Hutchinson had delayed part of the sale process, although sources said the deal had not been called off. I'm going to envision that this deal is not going to happen. I don't think the Chinese are going to want to lose their influence in ports around the world. Now, to be clear, ownership of a port doesn't mean they control a port. Just because China has a terminal, CK Hutchinson, has a terminal on each ends of the Panama Canal, they don't control the canal. That's not what that means. They do have a lot of visibility around the canal. They do control a lot of the port assets that come in and out of there because ships will dock there, offload containers, shift containers. They're big transshipment hubs right there where you bring container ships in. They offload some of their containers onto other ships. So they're very busy ports in that area, but the visibility that China gets from this is probably the most important element, because seeing where cargo is going, how it flows, trade patterns, gives China a lot of kind of soft power assets over trade around the world. And that came up in the U.S. Trade Representative's report, that 301 report. All right, let's go ahead and go to our last story. Our next story takes us to the issue of icebreakers. There is a lot of ice going on. You have the U.S. interest in Greenland. There are issues with the Arctic, with China and Russia in the region. The U.S. just completed the yearly resupply down to McMurdo Station in Antarctica, and icebreakers are kind of a big theme going on. So we got a couple of stories here that cover this. So a Reuters story, a G-Captain, icebreaker diplomacy. The Finnish President Stubb makes a surprise visit to meet with Trump. There is a big effort to get Finland to assist in the construction of icebreakers for the United States. They have the kind of wherewithal and the technology to build icebreakers. Finns are some of the biggest icebreaker builders in the world. Now, I will note that Finnish icebreakers are not of the kind of the size and scale that are really talked about what the U.S. wants. Finnish icebreakers are commercial in nature. They're not really military. And military icebreakers are a little bit different. However, in the short term, one of the things that the U.S. should be doing is a deal kind of akin to what the U.S., the British, and Australians are doing for the U.S. to build Virginia-class submarines for the Australians, what is known as AUKUS. We should be working with the Finns on a similar agreement. Build 1 or 2 or 3 icebreakers over in Finland, and then start building them here in the United States. Bring that technology across. In the meantime, South Korea is bolstering its capabilities, moving ahead with a next-generation icebreaker. So, I mean, if we don't want to use the Finns, then the South Koreans could be an alternative there who are moving ahead with a new design. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the icebreaking program once again hits another, success. I don't know what to call it anymore. It's not a success. The word you do not use with U.S. icebreakers is success. So Bollinger Shipyard, it was awarded nearly $1 billion to cover costs overruns of the Coast Guard Polar Security Cutter Program. This was a program that was being built by VT Halter. VT Halter went bust. Bollinger bought up the company. Now they got that contract with them. Understand, this contract was put together by NAVSEA, the Navy Sea Systems Command. And NAVSEA basically awarded it to the one shipyard they don't care about, and that is Bollinger. Sorry, Bollinger, I don't mean to be cruel to you, but that's basically what they did. They gave Bollinger the kind of consolation prize here of the icebreaker. And Bollinger, it wasn't really the Bollinger, it was the VT Halter, but now it's over at Bollinger. And now Bollinger is trying to put together this program. It's in a mess. And it really needs a big reset. We need to be building heavy icebreakers. It's a big need. Sorry, Maui's rolling around here. We need to be building some heavy icebreakers. We only have the one that's currently in operation. The only reason we have the one running is because we're stealing parts from the other one, which we've decommissioned. And if we want to be serious up in the Arctic, particularly on the north slope of Alaska, maybe in and around Greenland, you have to have icebreakers to operate in this region. Now, the U.S. did just get a commercial icebreaker. So the U.S. does have a commercial icebreaker that it brought into the Coast Guard fleet. The plan is to have it achieve its initial operating readiness by August of 2025. This is not a heavy icebreaker. It is a light to medium icebreaker. It's not designed to do big operations up in and around the Arctic, but this was needed to help supplant what the U.S. had. Commercial icebreakers have their capability. The question is, what do you want a military-style icebreaker to do? Military-style icebreakers have to be deployed for long periods of time, helicopter capability, potential military capability, sensors, you name it. There's a lot more on it than just a standard kind of commercial icebreaker. And one of the reasons for the concern about having icebreakers in the Arctic is stories like this. Malt Humford over at G-Captain, China's new shipping line to expand Arctic container service after a profitable 2024 operation. Talked about the fact that last year was the biggest operation for Arctic service. They shipped more than 20,000 containers last year. I think it was over 30,000 tons of cargo moved through this Arctic route. One of the things we're seeing is that the Russians really want to expand this route quite a bit. And so if the U.S. wants an Arctic presence in and around the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait, the North Slope of Alaska, up in the northern Pacific, you really need icebreakers to do this. And I think you can expect to see the U.S. working a deal with the Finns, maybe the Koreans, to put this together. Canada is looking to build a heavy icebreaker. Again, I don't understand why we don't do it. I understand Jones Act has nothing to do with this. I keep hearing people say Jones Act, Jones Act. Jones Act deals with cargo. Jones Act deals with moving cargo between U.S. ports. Icebreakers have nothing to do with that. Icebreakers don't carry cargo. They don't. They break ice. That's what they do. And plus, these would be government-owned ships. Now, there's federal legislation about building ships in the U.S. that would have to be modified, but not the Jones Act. The Jones Act is not the end-all, be-all cause for all of the world's problems. I'm just sorry, it's not. And most people who talk about the Jones Act have no friggin' idea what they're talking about most of the time. They just think the Jones Act is the reason the U.S. is where it's at. It's not. There's a lot more complicated issues. Again, got a whole video that does that. Top 10 reasons why the U.S. found itself in its situation. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Until our next What the Ship, or our next episode of What's Going On with Shipping, or my next interview between two sterns. This is Sal, signing off.